I now call on Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan, who's sharing her time with Deputy Clare.
Daly, yes.
That's agreed. Is that agreed?
Thank you. I think it's very opportune having this debate on the Wildlife Amendment Bill in advance of the Animal and Welfare Bill, even though there's two different ministers involved. And even though this bill, it's quite technical, it's just and quite narrow, looking at the current hunting licence provisions for shooting wild birds and hares during open season. And just on the bird angle, first of all, I think there's a need that there's a protocol in place for reporting on the species and the numbers hunted, the bag returns, so that there can be a monitoring of the level of hunting pressures. Because there's a need to ensure that any changes in hunting pressure can be monitored, and I'm just wondering what the system is to do that exactly. There's also a need to review the listed bird species huntable in the open season, because some are of national and European concern for conservation. And wildlife in Ireland, of course, is a good indicator of environmental changes, so the monitoring is very significant, because we do know that some species are suffering serious declines, like the breeding curlew and other breeding wader species. And now we come to the hare, the poor hare. I don't know what the hare has ever done in Irish society and to Irish society to justify the treatment that has been meted out to the hare. First of all, through many years of coursing, and now through shooting the hare. And you talked about, kind of an open season. I mean, the open season for the hunting, the shooting of the hare is 5 months, but I think the open season on hares is 12 months of the year. My predecessor, the late Tony Gregory, was associated with a number of causes, like drugs and crime and street traders and housing, but animal welfare was one that was very central to his philosophy and to his thinking. And it was one of his deep regrets that more had not been done to progress the issue of animal welfare before he died, and in particular to the treatment of animals like the hare, the fox, the badger and the stag. And I'm absolutely appalled to think that there might be a rescinding of the ban on stag hunting. I think that would be a retrograde step. Tony Gregory was honoured in his life as being named Vice Principal of the Irish Civil Council Against Blood Sports at the time when the late Hugh Leonard was the president of that. And he used various mechanisms of parliamentary procedure to highlight the cause of animals and issues of cruelty. And in 1993, as you know, Minister, he sponsored a private member's bill on wildlife. But one of the points he made in that speech was he paid tribute to the democratic process that an independent member could do that. And he felt that it was a matter of immense public concern and interest. And he spoke of, quote, the welfare of the vulnerable and defenceless in nature's creation. And he saw that bill then as hopefully helping to end, quote, the medieval barbarity of hare coursing. He did acknowledge in 1993 the pressure that rural members would be under to oppose his bill. And he acknowledged how coursing clubs are a very powerful lobby in some rural areas. And of course, coming from Dublin Central, he wasn't under that pressure. But he did ask then that members would be able to decide for themselves that there would be a need to change the cruel practice. But of course, that didn't happen, and coursing wasn't banned in '93. And we know that hares have suffered a cruel end. And I just really object to the term of sport being applied to that so-called sport, regardless of whether the hare is muzzled or not, or whether it dies through one way or dies through being shot here, as proposed in the bill. He wasn't the first to try and get a hare coursing banned in Ireland, and it was just interesting to look back through this, because the first attempt was in November 1975, during a Senate debate on the Wildlife Bill, when our President, Michael D. Higgins, then a senator, who tried to have the bill amended to have coursing declared illegal. And interestingly, it was also backed by another former president, Mary Robinson, then senator, and Noel Browne. And one of the things President Michael D. said was, my view is that the barbaric practice of hare coursing should be stopped immediately. And I was reading a couple of other contributions from those in favour. They said that there was scope for escapes. Quote, the hares are properly trained. I wonder for what. That coursing was fundamental to our greyhound industry, but I don't agree with that at all. There are only 3 countries where coursing is allowed, including Ireland. Other countries where coursing is banned completely have very thriving greyhound industries. And another quote, that hares are adequately and perfectly cared for prior to coursing and after. And I was quite bemused by the after, as this was before muzzling, so I'm not too sure how many hares were actually left to be cared for after. Former President Mary Robinson felt coursing was a very cruel sport, unnecessary and a deliberate cruelty to animals. And Dr. Noel Browne referred to the hare, quote, as one of the gentlest of God's created animals, and that he was being inflicted on unnecessary pain on this very tiny animal, and he also called it a barbaric practice. And it was interesting that at that time, the British House of Commons had just passed a bill to abolish coursing, and we know that the British House of Commons would have had a high percentage of people who believed in blood sports, and yet they passed an act to ban it. Noel Brown went on to speak as a psychiatrist to look at the kind of people who indulge in what he called this masochistic practice. And he wondered about the emotional makeup of those people, that they would enjoy the sound of an animal screaming to death being torn to pieces. And he associated that kind of enjoyment with what one gets in, quote, the more disreputable night spots in Soho. Now, I don't think you'd have to go to Soho today for that. I'm sure there's nearer. The next political push came from Deputy Shatter, and he also had tried to make a move on this particular thing. Now, that was all in 1993, and I accept that those comments came before the muzzling of the greyhound was introduced, where the Irish Coursing Club were forced to muzzle at enclosed coursing meetings. So let's see what this supposedly humane practice of muzzling has actually done for the hare. About a month before each meeting, club members go into the countryside to collect hares in this process called netting, where you have gangs of supporters shouting and yelling to herd the hares into nets, which have been strategically placed. And then the hares are put into boxes for transport to the coursing venue. So there's another two aspects of cruelty. You know, the bill on the shooting of the hare doesn't go into too many details on that particular aspect. The next stage then is about training the hares. Now, maybe they get a better chance when they're being taken for coursing than they do when they're being shot, but I think that's debatable. Because releasing a wild animal into the coursing field would produce what the coursing supporters would see as very poor sport, because the hare wouldn't know where to run. Now, during the training weeks, the hares are kept herded together in an enclosure, which adds considerably to the stress that they're under, because the hare typically is a solitary creature which keeps itself to himself, doesn't live together in groups, so in captivity they're very prone to disease, and disease can spread easily. There is a level of secrecy around coursing and other blood sports, so it's difficult to get, accurate statistics, and it's difficult to know who to believe. On the coursing days, we're told each hare should only be coursed once, but coursing clubs are monitored by coursing officials and not an independent body. I think it's clear that the practice of blooding is widespread. And I know this for a fact because many greyhound owners will say that they have to have the greyhound blooded before that they can take part in any type of coursing. And what do they use? They use rabbits, and they've also used young kittens to enhance the performance of the greyhound. The other aspect is for greyhound owners who want to race their dog on a track have to registering the dog with the Irish Coursing Club, which seems to me an enforced subsidy of coursing. I think the majority of people are opposed to hare coursing. And I would think this idea also of hunting the hare by shooting it. And there have been many independent surveys that have been carried out over the years. And there was an interesting one recently on the Journal where those in favour of banning hare coursing were a considerable majority. Until then, the Journal discovered that there was a rigging of the poll, and they have the proof of this, by people who were pro-coursing. We know that all animal welfare organisations are also opposed to horsing. So what's the justification for trapping hares or any other animal, using them and their pain as an entertainment for a small minority who get pleasure and bet on the hares fighting for their lives as they're chased and terrorised by greyhounds? It's one-sided. The one side always wins. The greyhound might be muzzled, but the hares are terrorised, they're injured, and some have died. As far as the hare is concerned, it's fighting for its life. It doesn't know that the greyhound is muzzled. And muzzling doesn't prevent the hare from being tossed up in the air and injured. And then the lucky hare that reaches the escape area without being caught by the dogs, it's now in an enclosure. We don't know, we don't have the figures what happens to those, probably live to fight another day, or perhaps be released to be shot during this bill here. We're talking about an animal being chased by a much bigger animal, the greyhound.
Sorry, Deputy, sorry for interrupting you, but I'm obliged to inform you that you must stick to what's contained.
Yes, I'm talking about the animal and the hare.
We're not talking about coursing. It's not a bill on coursing.
Okay, but I'm using the opportunity.
I'm sorry, I just have to remind you.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make one point about the greyhound before I leave it, and that is that it also is a very gentle animal. And it also has been injured and has suffered particular injuries. And there's also a recent doping scandal in terms of greyhounds also. So coming back to the particular bill here, I'll just read this one. Animal Welfare World Organization defines animal welfare as, quote, an animal is in a good state of welfare if it's healthy, comfortable, well-nourished, safe, able to express innate behaviour, and if it's not suffering from unpleasant states such as pain, fear and distress. So I come back to the bill here, and it's an open season on hunting the hare, which I feel has enough to deal with in the coursing season. I made my points there about the birds and the importance of the registering for those particular species that's covered by the bill. So I leave it at that. Thank you.
Declare Daly.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle, and I'm certainly going to pick up from where Deputy O'Sullivan left off. I hope it doesn't upset you.
It's not upsetting me. It's a question of what's in the rules. You can only speak to what's contained in the bill.
Well, it is, but as Deputy O'Sullivan said, the purpose of this bill is to allow somebody with a hunting licence issued after August 1st, 2009 to carry on shooting wild birds and hares in the relevant open season. That's what it's about, and it puts to the forefront the issue of the welfare of hares and whether it is appropriate to treat them in this way. And I totally agree with the points made by Deputy O'Sullivan that with regard to the shooting of wild birds, the importance of the conservation of certain species of those must be adhered to. But it is appropriate for deputies to raise the issue here, what did the hare ever do on the Irish Parliament? Because we're here this morning discussing the fast-tracking through of a bill to allow wild birds and hares get shot, while a very large and important piece of legislation has been published, the Animal Health and Welfare Bill, which we haven't had the opportunity to debate in here. And that bill, which I think is vital, is being brought forward to protect animals from cruelty and unnecessary suffering. That bill is delayed, yet this bill is getting fast-tracked. And I do think it's appropriate to link the two, specifically because the Animal Health and Welfare Bill, which talks about the prohibition of terrifying or baiting an animal, then goes on to exempt hare coursing. So in one piece of legislation which acknowledges that hare coursing is cruel by taking and putting in an exemption for hares, so hares are exempt from protection in one piece of legislation and are included in this piece of legislation in order that they can get shot, presumably over the course of the next few months, in case maybe some of them got away or something like that. I don't really know what the agenda is, but it is appropriate to say that this barbarity must stop. And what did the hare ever do? We're talking here about a unique animal, an endemic subspecies which is found nowhere else in the world, and we're talking about licence provisions to allow them to go out and get shot in the open season. And it is tied in to other treatment of that species in relation to the hare coursing activity, an activity which has been allowed for, if you like, for over 100 years. Yet in other jurisdictions we see that activity criminalised and appropriately outlawed, in my opinion, in New South Wales in Australia in 1953, in New Zealand in 54, in Victoria, Australia in 64, South Australia 85, in Scotland in 02, in England and Wales in 05 and in Northern Ireland in 2010. And yet, while these countries are criminalising the treatment of and treating as a criminal offence hare coursing, we have the Irish jurisdiction carrying on regardless and allowing the treatment of hares in a totally inappropriate manner. And we do have the situation now on the scandal of 10 counties engaged in that activity, regular activity in Clare, in Kerry, in Cork, Kilkenny, Donegal, Tipperary, Wexford, Limerick, Galway, and in my own constituency in Balbriggan, the only part of County Dublin where this activity is allowed to go on. And I think it is appropriate, and we have to draw the attention to that, because we're talking about against the backdrop where the Irish Coursing Club has said that hares come to no harm in coursing, and that the existing rules governing the sport, as they call it, protect the animals. Now that is completely and utterly false and does not stand up to any scrutiny with regards
I've already
to the evidence.
that it's not, you're only entitled to speak what's in the bill, and I have to correct Deputy O'Sullivan. I'm only applying the rules of the House. This is not about coursing. This is extending a period of which certain shooting may take place of certain types of animals.
Yes.
It's nothing to do with coursing. So please Stick to what's in the bill. Thank you.
It is directly...
That's the rule of the House.
Well, you're talking about releasing...
But that's the rule of the House I'm talking
about. Yeah, but you're interpreting it, Councillor.
I'm not interpreting, I'm ruling.
Yeah, okay. Fair enough. We'll have an interesting commentary, I'd imagine, when we do get to the actual coursing bill from yourself. Well, clearly you have an opinion on the matter, all right. But
excuse me. Withdraw that remark.
Well,
withdraw that remark.
Well, okay, you don't then. I don't know what your opinion is on the matter.
Exactly.
Okay. But what I'm saying is that, in my opinion, the comments I'm making are relevant because we're talking about allowing those with a hunting licence go out and shoot hares for 5 months of the year, and for 12 months of the year we're linked to them in a coursing environment. And we do have to see it in the context of the protection of this species, and commentary made by the most foremost authority on this subject, the Irish Wildlife Trust. Now, the Irish Wildlife Trust are a conservation organisation. They have all of the relevant scientific data and expertise related to the status of the Irish hare population. These are, if you like, the experts about that species. And the Irish Wildlife Trust have said about the hare that they are an endemic subspecies to this island. In other words, they're found nowhere else in the world. And based on recent studies, the National Parks and Wildlife Service have assessed the conservation of the hare and expressed some concerns. They are saying that the population is stable, but with important population fluxes. They dealt with a species action plan for the Irish hare, was published by the same organisation, which states that populations are thought to have undergone a substantial decline in the past 15 to 20 years, while populations are thought to have fallen to a critical level in some areas. So we are talking about concern about the conservation of hares. And they do cite in that report, the Irish Wildlife Trust, that one of the reasons why the hare is threatened is the unsustainable taking of hares for sporting purposes, as one of the reasons why the species is in decline. Obviously, extending the hunting licence to allow a couple more of them get shot would also be an indication of a threat to the species as well. And the Irish Wildlife Trust believe that this is a very important species which needs to be protected, which is afforded protection under the Wildlife Act of 1976 as amended in 2000 and the EU Habitats Directive and so on, and measures need to be taken in place in order to protect it. So I think it is relevant to look at this in its entirety, to link it to the fact that this government has been incredibly slow in bringing forward legislation to protect animals from cruelty, and yet at the same time can give time to fast-track a measure which allows more of them get shot. And to me, I think it's particularly reprehensible that we're doing it at the moment. I think when we look at birds and that whole area too, we are talking about, and other deputies have made the point, that shooting animals and shooting wildlife is good for tourism. Well, you can just about make the opposite argument as well, is that bird watching and other activities of those species are also hugely important for local tourism and so on. So preventing wild birds getting shot actually is good for the economy as well. And I think in that sense, extending the bill in this way is not an appropriate measure and not one that we should be taking part in. So for those reasons, I don't agree with the bill.
Thank you.